Hello fellow readers and readeresses. In 2023, I read 100 books, which is not the biggest number of books I've seen people read, but it's also not a small number. It surely is enough to allow for some great reads and some not so great ones. I talk about the former in a video I posted 2 days ago, which you can watch over here, and today I'm going to talk about the latter, namely the worst and most disappointing books I read in 2023. There are a lot of popular and beloved books on this list, so I am very much looking forward to all the creative ways people will find to call me ignorant. Although I am sitting here criticizing, so I guess it's fair game. Now, this should go without saying, but if you happen to have read and loved any of the books on this list, that is perfectly valid. We are all different people with different experiences which shape how we see things. Liking any of the books I will talk about today doesn't make you a bad person, nor does it make you a stupid or ignorant person. It just makes you a person with a different opinion than mine, and I respect that. I won't think less of you, and I hope you won't think less of me either. But if you do, that is also valid. You don't need my justification, but you have it anyway. First, we will stop on the 6 books that, while not the worst of 2023, still left me quite disappointed in one way or another. Starting with Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This is an adult, standalone with an asterisk epic fantasy set in the First Law world. I'm saying with an asterisk because this one technically takes place after the First Law trilogy, and some of the secondary characters are present in this book. This one truly pains me. I had such high expectations from this book because I have read and loved other books by the author prior to it, namely the First Law trilogy. It's one of my favorite series of all times. So to be back in this world and get to see some of the secondary characters was so exciting to me. However, I ended up feeling very disappointed specifically by the character development in this book. One thing I find to be a non-negotiable in every book is consistency. If you're going to establish a certain ethical standard, I expect you to uphold it consistently. Or if you decide to change it, I expect you to justify it accordingly on page, and in this case, I believe that the author failed to do either. Not to mention that after the first 20% of the book, I felt mildly bored, and that is because I couldn't care less about the characters, and therefore the outcome of their struggles was irrelevant. And the stakes were kind of low, all things considered. Next we have Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is an adult standalone historical fiction, and I had such high expectations for it. And while it had quite a lot to offer, I found myself questioning the merits of the fiction in it. Because while the historical elements were amazing and the beginning very engaging, after the first part, I felt like the book kind of overstayed its welcome. We followed too many characters for too little, and there was ultimately no wisdom to offset the injustices and terrible suffering our characters went through. I found the book strangely nihilistic, and frankly, I don't like to read nihilistic books. Red Seas Under Red Skies. This is an adult high fantasy and the second book in the Gentleman Bastard series. This is another really painful one. I loved The Lies of Locke Lamora, the first book in the series. It had a bit of a slow start, but ultimately made my best books of 2021. This one, on the other hand, started really strong and I was really engaged, and then almost halfway through, the author seemingly decided that that's not the story he wanted to tell and completely changed the setting and the main players. And that change, in my opinion, was extremely abrupt and uncalled for. And then in the final 2 chapters, he had to scramble to tie all the threads he started with, and in my opinion, didn't do a great job with it. Some of the mysteries that he set up and I was looking forward to the most ended up falling super flat. I still love our main 2 protagonists and some of the supporting cast, plus there were some better moments in the book. I just expected way more. A Reaper at the Gates by Saba Tahir. Is this gonna stay? Stay there. This is a YA fantasy and the 3rd book in an Ember in the Ashes series. Boy, did I want to love this series because I loved book 1 and I find this world so fascinating. But after the 2nd book in this series, A Torch Against the Night, made my worst books of 2022 list, I should have known better and not expect so much, yet I still did. Because there are so many things I still liked about this book and so many things I would like to see resolved. I want our characters to finally catch a break and be happy. I'm just starting to realize that the way this author tells a story is utterly unpleasant for me, and I'm just gonna give up on trying to make this work. The Duke and I by Julia Quinn. This is an adult historical romance and the first book in the Bridgerton series. I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not big on romance, so when I initially started reading this book, my expectations were quite low. But then I was blown away by how engaging the plot was, how interesting the characters, and by the author's amazing writing style. It reminded me a lot of Jane Austen's seamless wit and easy flow. So I was setting up to give the book 5 stars. But then the author wrote a scene that left me shocked and angry, and for the life of me, I cannot understand what compelled her to put a scene like that in a romance book of all things. I'm talking about our main character forcing herself on her love interest, and while there are some negative consequences, those are only temporary, and she ultimately never apologizes or truly regrets it. In fact, at the end, she is kind of presented as the victim of all this, and her love interest ends up coming around. I got so angry with this book, I kinda ended up throwing it at the wall. And the last one on this list is 11th Cycle by Kian and Ardalan. This is an adult grimdark high fantasy and the first book in the Mistland series. It is also self-published. This book had such an amazing potential brought on by original concepts and world building and managed to squander it in such a spectacular way because of its poor execution. I am still kind of angry about it. I am actually planning on filming a separate video for this book because I have so much to say, and when I do, I will link it in the video description. In the meantime, if you're interested in hearing an abbreviated version of my thoughts, you can watch my December reading wrap-up, which is also linked in the video description. Now that we're done with the good books that disappointed me, let's look at the absolute worst books that I read in 2023. Starting with Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. This is an adult standalone contemporary romance, and boy was this book annoying. I have a full video where I read, discuss, and review this book alongside some other very popular romances, which you can watch in the video description if you're interested in this kind of thing. But safe to say, I hated this whole thing, starting with the incredibly pretentious writing style. Every sentence from this book sounded like it was pronounced entirely through the nose. It was intimate because it was not. It was religious because it was not. It was beautiful because of how twisted and soulless and ugly it was. It was special only because of how unspecial it was. Fortunately or unfortunately, she believed in everything and nothing. You can't just say that things are a certain way because they're not that way and then act like it's some sort of profound wisdom. Then there was the issue of both main characters being massive douchebags and me continuously rooting for them both to die. Unfortunately, this being a romance book, that wasn't very likely. To top it all off, there was open cheating in this book, which was brushed off as something not a big deal because it was the main character who was doing it. And I want to clarify that I have absolutely no issue with cheating being discussed in fiction, but pretending like it's not only okay but somehow hot drives me up the wall. I hated this whole thing. Next we have Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is an adult standalone historical dark academia fantasy, and I have never been this bored by a book written so well. I was so impressed when I initially picked up this book because the author demonstrated both knowledge and philosophical prowess, or so I thought until I started getting deeper into the book and patterns started to bleed through the endless barrage of linguistic theory. This book is the most unoriginal piece of work I have read in a very, very long time. There is not a single original thought in this entire story. 90% of it is reformatted basic linguistic theory made to sound not at all different from what you will find in any textbook on the subject and what I am forced to assume the author's own recycled university thesis. And a generous part of the other 10% was spent on her criticizing classical authors through the lens of modern morals, as though their works are no longer valuable because they wrote in different times. You don't have to hate the authors of yesterday because they lived when they did, especially when you're using excerpts of their work to make your book sound more intellectual. You're not a better person for holding our modern morals today when it's easy to do so. I am baffled at people's unwillingness to admit that. I'm gonna interject here to clarify something that, in my opinion, doesn't need clarification, but I'm still gonna do it to avoid any sort of misunderstanding. I support the vast majority of the modern politics, especially when it comes to slavery, oppression, and conquest. My ancestors were also slaves for 500 years to the Ottoman Empire. We were actually considered human chattel. Our country was freed more than a decade after slavery was abolished in the US. A lot of atrocities were committed, whole cities were decapitated, and I still find the works of a lot of Ottoman writers fascinating. It is important that we cherish the accomplishments of the people who came before us, sometimes in spite of who they were and what they did. We would all like to believe that had it been us in their shoes, we would have done better. We would have stood up for freedom and justice, but we don't know. And I can guarantee you that 98% of the people who claim they would have done absolutely nothing and gone with the flow, because that's how we are as humans. We want to be accepted. And going against the grain at a time when there's no social media to pat you on the shoulder for every mildly profound thing you say would have been way, way more difficult. All I'm trying to say is that it's important that we give the high horse a rest every now and then. All the characters in this book were made to appear as mouthpieces for modern politics, and you couldn't find nuance in them to save your life. They were bland, inconsistent, and somewhat distant. Like, I wasn't reading a story about them, but rather reading a story that they happened to be dragged into at times. But worst of all was the setting. Let me lay it out for you plainly. This is a rigid historical fiction that is masquerading as fantasy. The setting is not based in history. It tries to copy history entirely with tiny embellishments that are supposed to be perceived as authentic. The author has injected magic openly into our world, but made sure that said magic changes absolutely nothing through history. Let me tell you this. If we have the exact same Earth, with the only difference being that foxes were green, we would have vastly different history. Yet in an Earth where countries with less widespread languages there is magic, history is exactly the same? Please, this is just lazy. This is what you get when you have an author who's used to learning but has no imagination. One last thing to mention here were the footnotes, which was basically the author telling you plainly, word for word, what you should take out of a situation instead of making the effort to weave the nuances into the story. She would just drop context in the form of, this is how you should feel about what you just read and why. I have rarely felt this patronized in my entire life. Like I'm not intelligent enough to be trusted with a story. I need to be guided through the intricacies of thinking. Kind of ironic considering the themes of this book. To me, Babel was such a tremendous waste of time and a massive disappointment. Next we have Vampire Academy by Richelle Mead. This is a YA urban fantasy and the first book in the eponymous series. I have a full video dedicated to this book, so I will try to be brief. I basically hated the main character of this book. She was stupid and selfish and unreasonable, and while I have been a teenager myself and been all of those things, I would expect a fiction story to point out those things as wrong and show me some sort of growth. Instead, what I saw was glorification of stupidity and outright abuse. The way that our main character treated her best friend and honestly everybody around her was abysmal. I had actually tried to read this book back in 2021, and because I hated it, I DNF'd it halfway through, and in 2023 I read it all and hated it even more. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, oh, you're too old for this book, there's no way you can understand, and while the former is true, the latter isn't. I have been a teenager and I know what it's like, and my issue wasn't with the plot or the themes, it was with the lack of moral values. You don't have to be 30 to know what it means to be a good friend, especially when that's the whole thing this book is repeatedly beating you over the head with. Next we have The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is a very popular standalone classic that I had been meaning to read for many years. Okay, am I the only one who thought that this book was very frustrating and kind of uncomfortable to read? It started quite promising. An innocent man is betrayed by envious and jealous fake friends and ends up in a terrible prison. There was some great adventure, some nice secrets, and some interesting characters. I was affected and engaged, and I had such high hopes. And then it turned into this strangely sadistic story about a guy whom, for the life of me, I could not understand. I'm gonna say it right here, the reformed Dante acted with absolutely no empathy. And not just towards his enemies, I have no issue with that, but even when he was attempting to do good, he was doing it in such a strangely sadistic way that I felt uncomfortable reading through it. I will venture into some spoilers here, so if you'd like to avoid them, skip to this timestamp. For example, the way he brought both the old and the young Morels to the brink of suicide before he intervened, despite his ability to do so earlier, was absolutely unnecessary and baffling. It only makes sense if he enjoyed the drama of it more than he cared about the well-being of his only true friends, and that is nothing to admire him for. And what is even more frustrating is that the author tried to play it off like, ooh, they know the depths of despair, so now they can experience true supreme happiness, which is simply dishonest. Indeed, overcoming troubles does help one experience higher level of happiness, but in these cases, it was unnecessarily prolonged and to the point of almost doing irreversible damage. Everything good Dante does in this book is tainted by his less than respectable motives and his villainous manner of execution. There was a lot of good in this book, but I ultimately left it with a bad feeling. I guess today I'm only going to be talking about super popular books. Next we have The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is an adult fantasy and the first book in the Dark Tower series. This is one of the weirdest books I've ever picked up and one of the least enjoyable to read. It reads like a fever dream more than an actual story, and at the end of it, I'm left to wonder what was the point of this entire word salad. After reading it, I found out that this was initially a bunch of unconnected short stories that were later on combined to make a full novel, and at the time the author was indulging in some less than savory substances, shall we say. And that explains a lot, but doesn't make the reading of this book any more enjoyable. You have a fusion, or should I say a confusion, of post-apocalyptic, western, and Arthurian fantasy, and pretty much no coherent storyline. Scenes follow one another in whatever order, pacing is a myth, and you couldn't find character motivation to save your life. The book had tons of potential, and reading it left me bored and/or lost and/or disgusted, depending on the chapter. I was indifferent to pretty much all the characters, pretty much all the time, to the point of hating them for wasting my time. Now, to be fair, I kinda like the setting, and I was told that books 2 and 3 from the series are superb, so I'm gonna give them a chance. Also, I'm looking forward to the day when I'm gonna read a Stephen King book that doesn't feature child molestation. Next we have Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. This is an adult dystopian urban fantasy and the first book in the Flesh and False God series. I have a full video dedicated to this book, which I'm gonna link in the video description, so I'm gonna be brief. Maybe. The book was marketed as fantasy romance, but to me, it didn't work as either of those. It had an interesting setting and some potential, but the execution was frankly lazy. There was barely any world building, a ton of plot holes, and a frankly despicable main character. Not to mention the copious amounts of exposition, which nearly got me to DNF this book early on. Next we have Neon Gods by Katie Robert. This is an adult urban fantasy erotica and the first book in the Dark Olympus series. Now, I would never usually pick up a book like that because it's not my forte, but as I mentioned earlier, I did a romance reading experiment in February, and this was one of the books in it. And my aversion to erotica aside, this book just wasn't good. The world building was vague at best, and the characters were just placeholders who liked to claim things about themselves and back them up with nothing. Now, I understand that this genre puts emphasis on different things than your standard fantasy or romance, but that doesn't mean it should ignore the fundamentals of storytelling. If I am to enjoy a book that's focusing so much on 2 or more people, I should care about them, right? And if I'm gonna get interested in a different world, I need to be able to imagine it. You can't just throw together a few words about a city and a river which supposedly exists somewhere, I'm not sure whether in the real world or in the spiritual realm, slap 2 randos in it with such and such kinks and call it a book. At least not a book worth reading, in my opinion. Next we have Song of Silver, Flame Like Night by Amelie Wen Zhao. This is a YA mythological fantasy romance and the first book in the Song of the Last Kingdom series. Oh boy, where do I begin? Let's begin with the magic system, which is what people seem to find as the most impressive and original aspect of this book. This novel is based on wuxia and xianxia. Wuxia literally means martial heroes and is a genre of Chinese fiction concerning the adventures of martial artists in ancient China. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is an example of wuxia. Xianxia, on the other hand, is a fantasy genre based on Chinese mythology and the concept of the chivalrous spirit, also influenced by wuxia. The Untamed, a Chinese TV drama based on the Grand Master of Demonic Cultivation novels, is a perfect example of xianxia. Speaking of which, I found quite a bit of inspiration taken straight from that show in this book. And by that I mean entire scenes as well as the so-called original magic system used by the Hin people. And am I the only one who feels like the metal magic used by the Elantians in this book was a ripoff from Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson? And the Elantians sound quite a bit like the Elantrians from Elantris by the same author? There are also quite a bit of similarities with the Poppy War, especially when you look at Zen, or as I like to call him, Discount Altan. And the 4 demon gods from this book are actually the 4 heavenly beasts from Taoism: the Azure Dragon, the Vermilion Bird, the White Tiger, and the Black Tortoise. The originality the author injected was to switch the colors of the dragon and the tiger and to call the Vermilion Bird the Crimson Phoenix. Which, okay, but what's the point? What, you loved those myths but didn't like the color scheme? She also calls them demon gods, which, considering the negative view that Taoism has towards demons, is a little bit disrespectful, especially considering that Taoism is still existing active religion. But But worry not, the author has no issue being disrespectful. She continuously refers to one of the characters with a cleft lip scar with a derogatory slur, which I will not be repeating here. This, I'm assuming, was done to weave a sympathetic backstory related to prejudice, but it was done so heavy-handedly and to such an unnecessary extent that had me wondering why. But I digress. We were talking about the similarities between this book and other works, and this is the predominant way of world building utilized by the author in this entire story, taking already existing concepts from mythology and religion, or maybe other authors' works, making a few superficial changes, and voila. And then there was this comment in the foreword of the book: "I am tired of Chinese girls being portrayed as beautiful, fragile flowers." This is in relation to her allegedly making the main character conventionally unattractive, shall we say, which on its own is perfectly valid, but becomes a little bit funny once you actually read her story. Because while our female protagonist is described as less than attractive, the author does everything she can to spare her from the real-life consequences of this condition. We were repeatedly told that she is not conventionally attractive, but in the first 3 chapters alone, we run into 3 different situations where men are enamored with her, including our super hot main guy Zen. And you might claim that that's because of her supposed character, but let me tell you, none of them had any time to discover said character before they got attracted. And here's the real kicker. As much as we want to give the ugly girl a stage, we refuse to have her fall for the ugly guy. Always the love interest is beautiful beyond description, often tall, dark, and mysterious. Enter the aforementioned Zen. It really frustrates me when our loudly proclaimed compassion and inclusivity extends only to our own selves and the characters that directly represent us. We demand love, even if we're less than perfect, whilst accepting nothing less than perfection in our partners. You want to be original? How's about the homely girl falls for the homely short guy next time? Or maybe just don't focus so much on her looks next time. Just tell us what she looks like. Brown hair, dark eyes, yay tall, and move on. Because right now, you tell me one thing and you show me another, and now I have to assume that you either lied to me or have no idea how to write. Either way, I no longer trust you. And speaking of attraction and romance in general, where was that? We got nothing from these two, least of all chemistry. The book was marketed as hate to love, slow burn, whilst all I saw was dry insta-love. And if you'd like to dispute that, please point me to the hate part. Don't worry, I'll wait. It didn't help that while we were told that our main female protagonist was strong and worthy of respect, all we saw was her being stubborn, foul-mouthed, hot-headed, and disrespectful. And there were so many contradictions. As a simple example here, she spent time and resources trying to find information about the hidden symbol, but when given the opportunity to learn, she mocks it and tries to skip out of it. How am I supposed to respect this girl and root for her? And all I said so far is bad, but I would have pushed through had it not been for the fact that, on top of it all, I was supremely bored the whole time. The book features so much exposition that it doesn't even feel like a real story, and my tolerance for exposition is quite high, I would say. The author spells out everything to you like you couldn't possibly deduce from context, and not gradually either. It's just a giant pile of exposition after a giant pile of exposition. Doesn't even matter if it's in the middle of action or breaking the flow of the story, it's there. All in all, the book is slow, overwritten, under-edited, unoriginal, and shallow. Next we have The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This is a YA dark academia fantasy and the first book in the Atlas series. Olivia Blake is the only author that appears twice on this list, and because of that, she will likely no longer appear in my TBR. I DNF'd this book at 54%, and I did it for a few reasons. The first of which is that the book was boring. How can anyone make a book about the Library of Alexandria of all places boring? I will never know. This is an achievement in and of itself. There was no atmosphere and no gripping mystery, and I am losing my desire to live just thinking about this book. Then there's the author's signature pretentious writing style. She's writing kind of like I did in high school, full of imaginary wit and ignorant revelations. It's kitschy and stale. And then best of all were the empty and annoying characters. It's just a bunch of pompous fools who wouldn't stop bitching and moaning about the terrible weight of all the magnificent gifts they were imbued with. Don't you just love it when self-centered pseudo-intellectual elitists wax poetically about the woes of capitalism and oppression, even whilst exploiting it and scrunching up their noses at anyone who isn't them because they're so much better than anybody else. We have the unintentional irony of some of the most pretentious characters I have ever seen bemoaning high society whilst being the epitome of it. And last on my list for today is Lies We Sing to the Sea by Sarah Underwood. I hope I'm not blinding you accidentally. This is a young adult to new adult standalone mythological fantasy. I recently spoke about this book in my December wrap-up, and since I think I said what I wanted to say in that video quite nicely, I'm gonna inject a clip from it right here. This is a young adult standalone mythological fantasy that was inspired by the Odyssey, supposedly, though given that the author has openly admitted that she's never read the Odyssey, this is a little questionable. This is the Illumicrate special edition of the book, and it's very, very pretty. Now, when it comes to the story itself, let me say this. It is well written. The author knows how to write proper, beautiful sentences. It's just that the sum of those proper, beautiful sentences is aggressively mediocre. And this is not the first book recently that I noticed being picked up by traditional publishing and getting all this promotion and these beautiful special editions while being of such low substance. I'm telling you, traditional publishing industry these days is gonna pick up and publish whatever as long as it checks certain boxes, and sadly, none of these boxes appears to be story quality. It's all just a bunch of clickbait. And what makes it worse is that the majority of the people who rated this book low on Goodreads, of which there are many, didn't even mention any of this. They talked about things that have nothing to do with the book, like, oh, the author is not Greek but benefits from Greek culture. Really? Is she the first one? Are we forgetting Rick Riordan and Madeline Miller and Margaret Atwood and Alexandra Bracken and countless others? Why are we acting as though Greek mythology has not become part of pop culture these days? Yes, not everybody is an expert in it, but everybody can get inspired by it. And yes, it is lazy and disrespectful to not even spare the time to read the original story which you are supposedly working off of. But she could have still written a good story, even if not accurate with the original. It's fiction after all. The problem is that she didn't write a good story, not that she's not properly representing the original or where she comes from. Would it have been better had a Greek person wrote this mediocre nonsense? Would the author being Greek made it worth your time reading a shallow story? I feel that we're focusing on the wrong things here, that we're valuing symbols more than substance. Over 70% of the negative reviews I saw on Goodreads were talking about who the author was and what she said in an interview, and nothing about the book itself, which leads me to suspect that a big chunk of these people didn't even read the damn thing, which, considering that they're mocking her for not reading the original story, I find quite hypocritical. And don't get me wrong, I'm not excusing her laziness, I'm just saying that you can't criticize something in one breath and then go ahead and do the same thing in the next one. And I don't want to get into the whole thing with fake reviews because honestly, who cares? And you've probably already had enough of my rantings. To summarize, the book is well written when it comes to strictly handling the language, but boring and bland and lazy when it comes to the story itself. I will give it an extra point for the bold ending, but that's pretty much it. I gave it 2 stars. And those, my friends, were the worst, in my opinion, books that I read in 2023. The video was quite long, but I'm hoping not quite as boring. Please do not take my criticism of these books as an attack on your personal experience or taste. I will never fault somebody for liking a book I didn't, or vice versa. If there's one thing we truly own in this life, it's our minds and the thoughts in them. I shared mine with you today, and I hope you will do the same in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see my favorite books of 2023, check out this video. Bye!